these words, what they stand for. Okay, good. So if we start from the very beginning, how is the text introduced, or how does the novel open? What do we get in the introduction? Well, in the very first line, you have a very good example of an intensifier, and this is this word exceptionally. So that's like one thing about excellent writers. They're very precise with their words, and if a good writer, if they choose their words carefully, they can achieve a lot of these wonderful effects, which are extremely lively and vivid and capturing, even with a very traditional style of narration. So they don't really have to violate the chronology or introduce heavy-duty symbolism. So even with this like quite ordinary flow of the text, something that we're accustomed to, something that's very traditional, if you use specific words, that gives wonderful vividness to the text and makes it extremely lively and strong. Okay, so he says on an exceptionally hot evening. So like that's the first, this word exceptional is the first example of an intensifier. So adjectives are intensifiers throughout the text. Early in July, a young man came out of the garret in which he lodged at S Place and walked slowly as though in hesitation towards Cambridge. Walked slowly as though in hesitation. We already have this announcement of his state of mind, that he's hesitating. So he's dwelling on something that's causing problems for him. So in the very opening, the very first line, we're introduced to let's say the general setting, and then the main character is also mentioned for the first time. The narration starts in third person and also unfolds in third person with focus shifts where we have switches to the internal monologues. The second passage of the text actually contains some examples of irony, verbal irony. Can you maybe tell me where they are? Just read the second passage briefly and then try to look for the ironic comments in the text.
Maybe this more like a cupboard than a room.
Absolutely. So this is also a simile, by the way, as a figure of speech, that his room was extremely small. So it was more like a cupboard. What about the very first sentence in the second paragraph? He had successfully avoided meeting his landlady on the staircase. This he had successfully avoided. This is irony, right? I mean, his intention was not to run into her because he was annoyed by her. So this is a kind of an ironic comment. It's also an explanation. Dostoevsky has a lot of these interferences in the text where he makes a comment such as this one, which could be ironic, or it could simply be an explanation where he additionally communicates something important to the reader. And he uses it in small steps, in small amounts, but in a very, very precise manner. So yeah, like the very opening sentence is the first example. The simile in the second sentence, the second row, so the comparison to the cupboard, is the second one. Is there anything else that could be interpreted as verbal irony in this passage?
Maybe obliged.
Again, the usage of the precise vocabulary. So every time he went out, he was obliged to pass her kitchen. So like there was no way to avoid this. And by using this particular word, this particular verb here, Dostoevsky is again quite successfully hinting at us that, this wasn't what he wanted to do. Okay, so he was obliged to pass her kitchen, and then another intensifier, the door of which invariably stood open. So the door was always open, which was making it even more difficult to avoid meeting the landlady. So like a lot of irony, see a lot of like these interfering ironic comments, which contextualize the initial motivation of the main character to kill his landlady, which is of course going to the reflections and like the first thoughts about it, and then the event are going to come later. But the motivation is being announced from the very start in like these tiny steps. Another intensifier at the last sentence of the second paragraph, where you have he was hopelessly in debt. So this again, this adjective hopelessly, he was hopelessly in debt to his landlady and was afraid of meeting her. So this intensifier again is an interfering explanation of the state of affairs, which is, you know, currently happening, and again serves to build his motivation. Okay, and then in the what do we have in the third paragraph? So Dostoevsky sort of continues to explain things to us. What is he explaining next? Why was he afraid of his landlady?
Because he was in debt.
So yeah, because he owed her money, and the
And she
situation
was annoying to him.
was hopeless. But he sort of also defends him a little. Do you see that? Like in this particular sentence where he says this was not because he was cowardly or abject. It was quite the contrary. So he was none of these things. There was like, Dostoevsky sort of implies that he was a dignified, a standing up young man, but he just had like this unfavorable streak of events, and the circumstances are working against him, and he's finding it more and more difficult to cope with his own personal tragic reality. So he's sort of defending him, explaining things for us in his favor. And yet also at the same time, he's giving us this, you know, moment where he is reflecting on murder as a way out. So this is also kind of dramatic irony already happening at the very opening of the novel. So he was so deeply immersed in these troubles that he was facing that he had been completely absorbed in himself, isolated from his fellows, not only from his landlady, but from everybody else. He was scarcely communicating with anybody. He was crushed by poverty. He was anxious. He was completely outside of the practical, the real life matters. Like above all that, because of this huge trouble, the amount of trouble that was pressing on him. So this is also all an explanation for the motivation. We're building on the motivation of the main character. So starting from this general introduction, and then the brief reflection on the setting, the place of life, and then the explanation of his psychological and emotional state of mind. In paragraph 4, Dostoevsky now sort of zooms in onto the story, right? And then focuses on the very current present moment. And then we have also a shift of the focus in the narrative, and we switch to the first person monologue. And we are especially interested in this monologue. So what's happening in the first monologue? What are we given there? What do we learn about the main character? It starts with, I want to attempt a thing like that, and I'm frightened by these trifles, and then so on. So what is the purpose of this monologue in the text?
Well, maybe it could be connected to his theory, and as well this contradicting of himself, really.
Mm-hmm. What is he contradicting on?
Well, he wants.
Where do you see this contradiction?
Well, he wants to attempt murder, but at the same time he's frightened because I guess his moral is still there, living inside of him.
He is. So how is he entertaining the idea? First of all, it's hugely striking, as we said, that he never, even when he talks to himself, he never uses the actual word. Okay? This is very, very important in the text. He never, like for a single moment, actually pronounces, not even in his mind, he doesn't use the words kill or murder. He just says that, which is there to sort of show us that he, even though he's entertaining the idea, that he's not being completely honest, not even with himself, because he's pretending that he's not really thinking about it. If you look at the closing part of the monologue, he says something like, why am I going there? Am I capable of that? Is that serious? And then he says, it's not serious at all. Okay, so he's sort of thinking about it, but at the same time, he's explaining both to himself and consequently to us who are reading the novel that he's not really serious about it. And it crossed his mind in some kind of a form which seems like maybe an easy way out, but the writer has already explained the difficult circumstances under which, okay, who wouldn't think of something like that, because it would be so easy and he would be free of all the troubles. But at the same time, he's not serious about it, which is, why it's maybe okay to think something like that just for a second, because he's not really going to do it. And he doesn't have any kind of a real intention of doing it, right? So like this first monologue, as you said, illustrates the internal conflict of the main character, where he's sort of distantly entertaining an idea, but is not really brave enough or resolved enough to admit it to anybody, starting from himself, that he may even be capable of doing something so horrible. So the purpose of this first monologue is for us to learn something to learn more about the main character, now from a shifted perspective, from his own perspective. And it's also there to sort of build on the sympathy, to make the reader understanding and sympathetic, to maybe even identify with on some level with the tragedy and the trouble that the main character is in. And then following this internal monologue in the next paragraph, and this is really a gradation, the narrative is given to us in step, where every step, like the next stage, the next level of the story, is enhancing more on this starting idea of hopelessness and tragedy that we were introduced to in the very beginning. So the next paragraph is now the description of the atmosphere. Like again, the perspective shifts again from this first person internal monologue into the third person narrative again, and we are given the description of the surrounding of the main character, through which the atmosphere in the story is built. And what is this atmosphere like? How would you summarize it? How does it make you feel? What do we learn about, whatever is surrounding the main character on the outside? What is he facing in the street?
It kind of reflects the way he feels.
Mm-hmm.
It all kind of feels anxious. I don't know, the heat in the street was terrible, the airlessness, the bustle and the plaster, bricks and dust scaffolding. It all feels very, I don't know, it says that it's hard on him, and it sort of also feels hard on us, because we saw what he's thinking, and now the outer world is kind of the same.
The same. It says here, the insufferable stench from the pothouses. Again, like, pay attention to these adjectives. The intensifiers are there to give you a strong description, which is, yes, as you said, and you're right, absolutely a reflection of his inner world, which on the outside is the same, which makes it also even more pressing. Also, in this shift to the third person, in the same passage, in the continuation, we get, for the first time, we get the physical description of the main character. And what do we learn about him? Who is he? What does he look like? How is he dressed?
Well, he is physically very attractive, but he is dressed really shabby, and he looks horrible. He looks like he's homeless or something even worse.
Even worse. But before all that, before we learn about how shabby his clothes are and how poor he is, you have this sentence where Dostoevsky again uses an intensifier, and he says he was, by the way, he was, so an expression of the profound disgust gleamed for a moment on the young man's refined face, right? And then he was, by the way, exceptionally handsome and above the average height, slim, well-built, with beautiful dark eyes and dark brown hair. So it's a very detailed physical description where we learn something about his youth, about his exceptional physical beauty and refined face. And then we have this conflict again of that kind of a physical description, the beautiful dark eyes, dark hair, and so on. And then we know what's going on inside of his head and where he is, and then that he's so poorly dressed, and how like this outer world again reflects the difficulties that he is facing. This wasn't done like this by accident. Again, Dostoevsky is reaching for the reader to feel sympathetic with the prospective killer and the main character. He's not portraying him as black and white. He's also in the first monologue, he's giving us this inner moral dilemma that he's facing. So we also learn that he is not a cold-blooded killer. This is not just some premeditated, easy way out of the situation. He's like quite broken by it. And it's even that is bringing more and more difficulty to the main character. Okay. And then...
Sorry to interrupt you. Maybe this detail about his clothes and his real appearance, the beautiful brown eyes, and whatnot. Maybe that heightened eyes and all the beautiful things about him are the raw version of him, and the clothes, the shabby-looking clothes and the hat. Maybe that's just how the world changed him, and maybe that's like a kind of like a representation of a process of him becoming a murderer.
Exactly. It's like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde thing, only more subtle. So two versions of the same character, where we learn about this gentle young man who is simply unable to cope, and he's sort of a victim also. And then what others see from the outside, or what we would see from the outside if we weren't paying attention to all the other details. Yeah, so definitely these descriptions are the representations of the double nature of the main character, which is currently where the second additional nature is forced onto him and is being sort of built by the circumstance more than his own will. Yes, very good observation. Okay, and then what happens in the next passage where he is at the market, and then there is this unknown man in the street who greets him, and this then is actually sets the stage for the second monologue. So the next shift into his mind. What happens? There is like this tiny incident in the street. Why is this relevant? And what happens actually? Somebody greets him, and what do they say to him?
Hey there, German hatter.
Hey there, German hatter. Now, why is this detail important for the story?
Because maybe that hat was expensive, but he was happy.
It wasn't. Well, it was, but it was also standing out. And the fact that the hat is standing out is important. How and why?
Well, because all his clothes are really shabby and gross in a way, and then you see just a hat that's kind of nice. That yes, it is shabby too, but it was once upon a time nice. You could say it pictures that expensiveness once upon a time,
Yes.
somewhere in the past. But now he looks like a homeless man.
That's all true. I agree with everything you said, but why is this relevant? So it's not.
It also has to. Sorry. I think it also has to do with his desire to be invisible and not to be close to people. But then there's something that attracts the attention of other people.
Well, okay, it's just not true, but it's not only that. Because in the last monologue, like in the closing paragraph of the text that we are currently analyzing, okay, just take a moment and just read that briefly, and then we'll come back to this question of why the hat is important. So the very last paragraph, that's the internal monologue again. So I knew it, he muttered in confusion, I thought so, and so on.
Maybe his plan was to not be noticed at all, and he was because of the hat.
And why doesn't he want to be noticed?
Because of his plan.
Exactly. Okay. So now in the text, his motivation is sort of being more filtered. It's distilling into a decision to commit this murder. And he's planning to do it, although in the first monologue, he was scarcely entertaining the idea. And we were led into believing that he has this huge moral dilemma and that he won't even admit it to himself, because that's what he was thinking, right? And yet, after these couple of moments and the couple of descriptions and explanations that we were given in between, now we see him actually plotting and thinking about the subsequent events after he commits the act. And this hat is going to be a problem. And it's not only that he doesn't want to be noticed because he's so estranged from people, which is all true. And yeah, that part also stands. But it's also because he doesn't want to be noticed, because he doesn't want to be recognized. He doesn't want to be remembered maybe by a witness or seen in the street after he commits the act that he is planning on, which is why he needs to get rid of the hat. So what does he say to him? What is he saying in the monologue? What do we learn? Again, additionally, like this second monologue gives us a different state of mind. What is the state of mind like now? Is it the same confused young man? I'm sorry, go ahead.
He seems a little bit angry because, he's afraid, basically, that somebody's going to find out about him and his intention. But I think that he wouldn't plan in the first place all over again. I don't think the thought would come to his head again if the man didn't shout at him, because that was like kap koja prelila čašu kind of thing. Maybe that's what triggered the whole plan process again.
Maybe.
Well, at this point, at first he was this anxious, lost man, and at this point he is calculating what to do and how to hide himself. He says that what matters is that people would remember it, and that would give them a clue. So
that would give them a clue.
He's already thinking of doing it, so he needs to hide himself as well as he can.
All right. He says, for this business, remember in the first monologue, he was referring to this killing as the thing. But now he says, for this business, one should be as little conspicuous as possible. Trifles are what matter. Why? It's just that trifles that always ruin everything. Trifles ruin everything. So he could have like this perfect plan and he could commit the act perfectly and maybe even get away with it because that's what he's planning on. But then like the trifles, like these stupid little things such as the hat, might ruin everything in the end if he's not careful enough. So as you said, he's calculating, he's plotting, he's considering what might happen subsequently if he's not careful enough. So within this particular internal monologue, he is now resembling more, this mind of his resembling more the mind of the killer, much more than it was the case, in the first internal monologue. So the point with the whole text, the passage, is that you have this gradation where both the anxiety, the motivation, the intensity, the decision, the information about the character, everything is building up slowly but very, very precisely. And there's not a single loose moment in the story or an extra word that would, the words are extremely precise. The intensifiers are all there for a purpose, along with the similes and the comments and the explanations as well. So Dostoevsky sort of leads you unmistakably into what's going to be the heart of the story. And as you probably know from before, Crime and Punishment is dominantly a psychological novel. So it's not really so much about the narration. There's not much to the plot. You can retell the plot in 5 sentences, and then everything else is about the initial reflections and the post reflections on this act of the murder. I omitted to mention in the beginning that the text also has some of these words given in bold, like these are my hints to you, things that I imagine that you would need to look up in a dictionary. So again, if there are some words that you're not familiar with, please Google them so that you don't have like lexical gaps and lexical misunderstandings in the text. So I think that we should now go over the questions now. Do you maybe want to say something more about this, to clarify on something or to comment on something else before we move into the questions, to add something to the discussion?
Ja sam htjela samo pitam, ali moram da nađem to na početku kad smo pričali za ironiju, ali sam početak je neko bilo, ja mislim, za vrata. Samo da nađem sekund, izvinite. Ono za otvorene vrata, jel tu ironija je to što to vrata su sve vremena otvorena, a on nju izbegava i on izbegava da je vidi.
Tako je. Yeah, I would say that this is just maybe not situational, but this is just verbal irony, because this adjective invariably sort of enhances the fact that he was never successful in his wish to avoid his landlady. So, like, he always wants to avoid her, but the door is always open, and right. So the way in which he uses the way in which the narrator uses the adjective is a case of verbal irony, because it enhances the fact, that it's simply impossible. He wants to, but he cannot. It's like when you use this adverb always when you're annoyed by something, you say, my sister is always taking my things without asking, or he's always late, or whatever. When you use always like that, just like invariably was used here, it always enhances some kind of a negative emotion, right? So that in combination with the situation creates a kind of a verbal irony. Okay. So again, hopefully we answered the questions already, but I just want to go over them so that, maybe you want something additional to write down and that everything is clear. So question number 1 is, what is the atmosphere like, and what is the tone of the narration like? I mean, the atmosphere and the tone are the same, right? They're completely overlapping. How would you describe the atmosphere?
Tense.
Tense. Okay, what else? Just more descriptive words, more description of the atmosphere. And I don't mean just the physical context, but everything, like the whole text.
Kind of anxious in a way.
Tense and anxious.
Extremely psychological, based on the psychological state of.
And if we want to be precise about the psychological state, would we say that it's optimistic or pessimistic?
Pessimistic.
It's pessimistic and dark and gloomy and tense and whatever else you can think of along those lines. Okay, good. Okay, what about the narrative techniques? We have 2 basic narrative techniques, which serve there to also introduce focus shifts. And the first one, and the one that's present in the frame story and throughout the text, is the third person narration. And there is like this omniscient narrator. And what's the second one?
First person.
First person internal monologue. Yes. So these 2 are combined. How does the writer communicate with the reader? Remember those comments and explanations that we were mentioning. When do they happen and what is their purpose? Well, when the writer wants to explain something, he gives these additional... It could be, yes, the ironic comments.
Adjectives.
Adjectives, so... ironic comments, adjectives, or intensifiers, descriptions. Okay, these role descriptions, meaning both physical descriptions and explanations of his motivation, like in the third paragraph, where he says, after this sentence, he was hopelessly in debt to his landlady and was afraid of meeting her. This is also an explanation in the context. And then in the third paragraph, Dostoevsky says this was not because he was cowardly and abject. Okay, so he's also explaining something about the main character, about who he is. He also does that in the physical description, and that, so he's explaining that on one hand, and on the other hand, he's explaining the circumstances that the character is in. Also, the contrast between the physical description and the clothes that he's wearing that we were mentioning earlier. These are all communicative explanations, like this little explanatory episode that Dostoevsky introduces into the text to make everything clear to the reader. Okay. Who's the narrator? Well, the writer.
The narrator, and when the first person is then Raskolnikov.
Yes, and the main narrator, the frame story narrator, is the writer, and that goes on in the third person narrative. Okay, expressive means and stylistic devices. We have a lot of intensifiers. So these adjectives, like go through the text again, underline them all. And then we have similes. We have similes more than metaphor. And then we have like full picture descriptions, both in the description, so the narrative descriptions of the setting and the character, both from the inside and from the outside. So it's very, very traditional, nothing really experimental here. And yet it's very, very capturing and strong. Okay, number 6, exemplify some implied elements of the plot which are present in the story but not stated explicitly. So all of these things that we learn about, which are not stated in explicit words. What is the most important thing there?
Murder.
Murder, of course. So the main character thinking about murder, because it was never given explicitly. And this was particularly implied in his internal monologues. And also, additionally, all these little comments again and explanations in which the writer is trying to build some kind of a sympathy for the main character. So he's sort of explaining to us, this is a decent young man who is the victim of these unfavorable circumstances. So all these moments where we get hints like that are also something which is implicitly given and yet quite relevant for the story. Okay, who are the characters? That's clear. And what is the plot? We also mentioned that. What are the two settings? How would you explain? What would you say about the setting of the story?
Maybe one of them would be the house where he lives, and the other the street.
Definitely. Okay, so even the external setting is given on like 2 levels. And in addition to that, the outside, you also again have this representation of the inner world. We had the same thing with Asterion last week, right? So we have like this inside state of mind of the main character, and then we have the surroundings, which are completely in accordance, as we said earlier. Like we take a look from his inside to the outside, to the world around him, and it's the same. Okay, so they go closely hand in hand. Can you identify different layers of the text and how many? Well, okay, we mentioned that also, but we have at least two: the physical world, and then so the physical layer and the psychological layer on top of that, and the two go hand in hand and reflect each other. And okay, questions 9 and 10, I guess, are your personal comments. By the way, have you read the novel? Any of you? Do you know the whole story, the whole novel?
Yes.
Do you know the writer? It's probably, for me at least, he's maybe one of my most favorite writers of all time. So like, I strongly recommend Dostoevsky. It has a healing power, and it's a wonderful writer. This particular text, how does it make you feel, and why? And which element is maybe for you personally the strongest and the most capturing, and why, if anything?
Well, I read the book in high school, and we talked a lot about it in literature class, and later I saw the play, and I loved the book. It was really good. I love any book that can be talked about for hours, and this one is very complex. So it has many layers to it, and we talked about how the crime is punishment in the end. So I don't know, it's incredible. I love talking about it even now.
And in this particular, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I think this artistic view of something that would normally be perceived as something awful,
Oh yes,
gross, or murder, and I think that reading the actual book is not that interesting as much as talking about it later on and having a discussion, a debate. That's what really makes it so interesting. At least for me, it makes me feel excited to talk about it all the time.
Right. It stirs a lot of the discussion, and it's sort of like these ideas stick with you. The reason that I asked about you reading the book is, if you have, it sort of stays with you for the rest of your life. And Dostoevsky, once you read his novels, always remains an important part of the intertext for you personally. I think that this is the case for everybody who's ever read anything by this writer. So every time you encounter a similar text or a similar topic, you sort of invoke, even if it just happens subconsciously, on certain moments or emotions that you had when you first time read Crime and Punishment. So yeah, in case you haven't read it, please go ahead and read it, because it really is a precious life experience. Okay, I think that's what we had planned for today. And again, as I said, I'm going to summarize this on like a page or two and post our discussion to the classroom. And I'll see you next week when we read Wuthering Heights. So unless you have any additional comments, anything else that you want to say, then I will close this for today, and I'll see you again next week. Okay.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.